Well, sorry about that delay. Thank you, everybody. I think I got everything underway here. Thanks for joining us on our River Rising Solutions webcast. I'm Shannon Blankenship, Advocacy Director at St. John's Riverkeeper, and today we're discussing resiliency in Houston with the city's Chief Resiliency Officer. Marissa Aho is Chief Resiliency Officer at the City of Houston, who will discuss what it took to launch the Resilient Houston strategy and help us learn from their success. For anyone that wants to stick around, at the end of the broadcast, we'll have time for questions, and I'll read from the chat window, as well as you can go on live and ask questions yourself. So please stick around and join us. But to begin, I just want to talk briefly about St. John's Riverkeeper. For anyone that does not know, we are a nonprofit environmental advocacy organization who speaks for the entire St. John's River watershed. We primarily work throughout the watershed to investigate pollution problems, advocate for policy changes, seek solutions with the community leaders and elected leaders, educate the public about what's going on, work to raise awareness about the issues impacting the river, and then always continuously involve and engage with citizens throughout the watershed. But the reason that we got moved into this web series on solutions to rising waters is because in the wake of Hurricane Irma in 2017, we launched a comprehensive community conversation through a series of town halls and eventual policy advocacy, as well as working directly with the city on implementation of ways that we would potentially feel more secure and more safe before the next storm hit. We know that every single pollution incident is an unmitigated impact to the St. John's River, and these pollution incidents will only continue as both storm frequency rises, precipitation from storms increase, and we see longer lasting, more significant storms in our watershed. So in the face of these future storms, really looking to solutions that will reduce their impact on the river has us trying to work alongside these solutions for rising waters. Now, again, in September of 2017, Hurricane Irma moved across the southern Atlantic and up the state of Florida. It moved along the St. John's River, starting at our headwaters and traveled north. By the time it left the state of Florida, it was a tropical storm 70 miles off the coast. By then, storm surge from the Atlantic Ocean combined with heavy rainfall that moved north through the St. John's, and it merged in downtown Jacksonville, and it impacted nearly every community throughout our watershed. Just 2 weeks earlier than Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Harvey was a devastating Category 4 hurricane that made landfall in Texas, causing catastrophic flooding, to say the least. In a 4-day period, parts of Houston received more than 40 inches of rain as Harvey very slowly moved through the terrain before dissipating. The city of Houston and Harris County were able to leverage the impact of the storm to ensure that they are more prepared than ever for the next event. And with that, I want to introduce our speaker that's going to tell us more about how Houston is more resilient today. Marissa Aho has served as Houston's Chief Resilience Officer for Mayor Sylvester Turner since February of 2019. In this role, she leads the resilience building efforts for the city's resiliency strategy. Resilient Houston, which has 5 chapters, 18 goals and targets, and 62 actions that address, among many challenges, flooding, climate change, inequity, housing affordability, and improved mobility. She previously served as Los Angeles's first Chief Resilience Officer beginning in 2015, and she currently serves as on the Global Steering Committee for the Resilient Cities Network. She has a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Political Science and Communications, Legal Institutions, Economics, and Government from the American University in Washington, D.C., and a Master's of Planning degree from the University of Southern California. So Ms. Aho, I'm going to turn this over to you for you to tell us about Resilient Houston.
Great. And while I'm getting my slides together, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to share the work that we've been doing. All right. How do the slides look?
Good on my end.
Great. So just to start out, Hurricane Harvey was really a pivotal moment in Houston, and 1 year later, approximately, but 1 year later is when Houston was announced as the sort of 101st resilient city through a $1.8 million grant by Shell to do this work, and to have me come from LA, where I did similar but different work, to then start the work in Houston and really build upon so much that was happening. And so we got started a little before I arrived on the work that I'll present today. Once the slides. There we go. It's a little slow. So really quickly, we released Resilient Houston in February of 2020, which now feels like a lifetime ago, but wasn't that long ago in reality. And the goal was really to create a framework that connected all of the things that were happening before Harvey, all of the different efforts that happened after Harvey, and then provided a future framework. So sometimes I refer to it as a bit of a quilt that needed all of those different patches in order to really exist the way that it does. But it looks to a future Houston that is a healthy place to live, an equitable, inclusive, and affordable city, a leader in climate adaptation, a city that grows up and not out, and a transformative economy that builds forward, and is really focused on having a comprehensive approach to resilience, the capacity to survive, adapt, and thrive no matter what chronic stresses and acute shocks. I really enjoy working at the intersection of the shocks and stresses. We know that our most vulnerable people, places, and systems are disproportionately affected when there is a disruption. And so, you know, daily I will be asking, how can we solve for more than one thing at the same time? And this is, if you're less familiar with Houston's sort of history of extreme population growth, that's the orange, with a number of really great events, and then a number of shocks and stresses that the city has been able to adapt from and be resilient, but it's always a struggle and we can always improve. And the idea of building back better or bouncing forward or using the opportunity of any sort of downturn to improve our systems and help our residents is what we try to do in all of these actions that we'll talk about in a minute. And this is sort of Houston a long time ago or not so long time ago, and Houston today. And we're known as the Bayou City. This is obviously a bayou from a very long time ago, and it's Buffalo Bayou, and this is Buffalo Bayou today, one of our premier parks that was created through a whole lot of partnerships and creativity and persistence. And just to orient everyone, we have a really diverse population. And so the way that we've been thinking about resilience is through this concept of scales. And so that will play out a little bit in a minute. But the idea of planning for people and making sure that we are ensuring that our people are resilient. And then looking at our diverse neighborhoods, we have 88 super neighborhoods in Houston. And the idea of looking at resilience at a neighborhood scale is really about the fact that neighborhoods would prioritize shocks and stresses differently. And so a one size fits all solution doesn't work. How do we work more with neighborhoods to figure out what their primary stresses and primary shocks are and address them? And then of course our bayous and our 22 watersheds and the bayous associated with them, and how do we look at each of those bayou and watershed systems to improve resilience for the whole system.
Marissa, can I ask on that slide there? I'm curious about the overlap of what you had just said with the neighborhoods, kind of all the neighborhoods really having different, maybe approaches, just stresses and shocks. And then this combination of the fact that the bayous and sort of what I would say, watersheds also have sort of very unique needs. And are there examples of where those two things kind of have come together, or sort of how do you do that? How do you overlap the community with the watershed boundaries to come up with some of these solutions?
Yeah, I think one of the examples where this is most evident was through our Living with Water work, which I'll highlight a little bit later, but happy to talk about it now because part of the process of doing the resilience work was a parallel process called Living with Water Houston. Other cities have done this as well. It's basically a Dutch dialogue concept. And so we worked with experts from the Netherlands. We worked with experts from New Orleans and planned out a report. It's very long that is on our website, but really looking at the scales and looking at specific recommendations for the region. And then we selected three specific neighborhoods that were on different bayou systems and looked at specific recommendations for those neighborhoods, but their sort of relationship with their bayou. There's a lot more work to be done here. And one of the actions or goals in the resilience strategy is around more neighborhood planning. And so we've committed to doing 50 neighborhood plans in the next 10 years. And we've started with the Mayor's Complete Communities program, looking at historically disinvested, underinvested neighborhoods. And one of them in particular, Kashmir Gardens, is part of the Mayor's Complete Communities program. It's part of the Living with Water report, and it's a real opportunity to look at the bayou planning with the community planning right next door to it.
Excellent, thank you.
Sure. So I'll keep going really quickly just to give you a sense of the size and scale of what we have done. So on the city scale, Houston is 667 square miles. But then this whole entire map that you see includes our extra territorial jurisdiction and our municipal utility districts, and all of these other partners and players that expand the size of the city much beyond the specific city boundaries. And then we have the region. And so we are one of a number of counties in the region. And we talk about Houston being a coastal city, even though we're not always thought of a coastal city, both by other coastal cities, I think, and also by our own residents who may not think about the Gulf that is just, less than an hour drive away, at least from where I live in Houston. And so so we started on this process. It's very scripted and a process that I conducted in Los Angeles as well, of really identifying all of the various shocks and stresses that we are susceptible to. And we organized them in this particular way very early on so that we could, so that they were a little more manageable, so that we could create working groups related to each of the different sections. And their names have changed slightly over time, but very slightly. So we have sort of a climate, living with water section, a health and safety section, an equity or equity and inclusion section, and then the built environment, which was really housing folks and transportation folks who didn't necessarily want to have the same conversation, but we put them together. And then the economy, which was really also tied to some of our infrastructure that wasn't specifically around housing or mobility. And so you'll notice that we did have public health emergency listed, but did not foresee what we are all experiencing today. But we'll talk about that towards the end as well. So I covered the scales for a particular reason, and that's because this is the framework that we used for the entire strategy. And so each chapter is about individuals, neighborhoods, the bayou, the city, and the region. And the region is so important because the shocks and stresses that we just listed don't know municipal boundaries. And so the idea that if we're working on resilience as a city, we need to be working on it with our regional partners, with our national partners, with our global partners, really. And there are so many opportunities in which to do so. So we expanded a boundary that would traditionally be a little bit smaller. And for each of the actions, we focused on implementation. I'm a planner. Sometimes planners don't fully embrace implementation when they're planning. And so we tried our best to think about barriers to implementation from the beginning. And we identified 6 barriers and/or opportunities to implement the actions that we were planning for. And so those include engagement and education, getting the word out better about things, communicating better about things, finance, innovative finance, ways to be able to pay for some of these things, or integrate them into existing systems because they're not really new, but they're a new way of going about something. Changes to either local, state, or federal policies that would help us implement. Looking at metrics and the importance of sort of, you can't manage what you don't measure. So we have 18 main targets, but then we're developing a whole host of other key performance indicators and metrics that we can track. And then the importance of partnerships, and also really tying our smart cities conversations with our resilience conversations so that our smart cities solutions can solve for our most urgent needs and our shocks and stresses and the things that we need to solve for quickly, and using creativity and innovation. So I wanted to just highlight a few actions, and I'll go pretty quickly through this. But in chapter 1, we talk about mobilizing our residents in order to adapt to climate change, which includes things like green stormwater infrastructure and things that individuals can do on sort of a property level, on a family level, on a small business level. And we also have focused on the importance of tying some of this work to jobs and job creation and workforce development, specifically around green jobs, looking at green stormwater infrastructure jobs, training opportunities, and ways to get more folks better jobs through our resilience building. In chapter 2, the neighborhoods, we talk about urban heat and extreme heat and the role that that plays as a co-benefit to a lot of the flood mitigation work that we're doing, to air quality work, and this idea of combating urban heat and extreme heat through tree planting, through shade structures, through cool roofs or cool pavement or green roofs, and all of the things that we could do to improve that work. We recently did urban heat mapping in August that we're going to get the results from in a few weeks, and really excited to look at how that can incorporate into everything else that we're doing. Also, this idea of developing neighborhood resilience hubs, which cities all over the world are working on. In Houston, they're referred to as lily pads, which I think is really fun, but also explains that these neighborhood resilience hubs need to be elevated and need to be places that aren't going to flood during a flooding event. And so those would be like one-stop shops where you could learn about and get resources for and training for being more resilient and tackling a lot of these issues. And then they would serve as additional capacity in an emergency and after an emergency on like a neighborhood scale. In chapter 3, we do have a target that I'll highlight around removing all habitable structures from the floodway by 2030. And we have a number of Houstonian families that live in our floodways. And so we are actively working with partners to address those issues, as well as constructing at least 500 miles of trails and bike lanes by 2025. And so we have an entire system of trails and bikeways around our bayous, and also looking at beyond our bayous and how to connect those bayou trails with each other. And so that's something that our Houston Parks Board and many other partners are leading, which is really great. But these actions are really about making room for water. And these were the lessons that we learned during the Living with Water workshops and report. And so we embedded them into the Bayou chapter, but also throughout the entire resilience strategy. So these are the 3 areas that we highlighted with specific neighborhood scale recommendations: Greens Point, Independence Heights, and Kashmere Gardens. And so then another action in chapter 3 is around increasing access to the bayous for recreational, health, and other community benefits. And there's so much opportunity here, even around things like trail-oriented development when appropriate, and how do we get more folks to turn their sort of front yard and their orient towards the bayou and really embrace the natural systems that we have here and improve them. And then on the city scale, really looking at how we holistically manage our water resources to be climate ready. The city is working towards a one water strategy that's very popular in a number of other places. And then on the regional scale, both conserving our regional undeveloped land for flood mitigation, environmental health, and recreation. And the city is working on some conservation opportunities as well in our parks, so that we can lead by example, and so that we can conserve land. We can ask others to do the same thing. And then finally, leveraging disaster recovery efforts to accelerate the implementation of our resilience measures. And I'm very lucky to work with our Harvey recovery team on a daily basis to integrate the resilience work and a lot of the actions in the resilience strategy into how we're recovering from Harvey and a number of other flood events that have happened over the last few years. And so these are some of the ways that we're specifically integrating green stormwater infrastructure into our disaster recovery efforts. I won't go through them all, but did want to highlight that we do have a incentives for green development report that we launched a little over a year ago. And that was a 1-year process with a lot of internal and external partners to identify which green stormwater incentives would work best for Houston out of a number of them that were identified. Houston's a little behind other places on implementing nature-based solutions and green stormwater infrastructure. And so this is something that we have really been working to accelerate lately. But 4 of the top incentives included integrating green stormwater infrastructure into our development rules, an award and recognition program, increasing permitting process speed and certainty for projects that incorporate green stormwater infrastructure. And then finally, in big letters, property tax abatement. This is the one that we're working on and have a goal of getting completed by the end of this year. So, of course, green stormwater infrastructure can solve for so many shocks and stresses that it's something that we really are trying to incorporate as we continue with having this conversation about solving for more than one thing and co-benefits of what are the opportunities, both private sector, public sector, nonprofit sector, like how can we really get to a turning point where green stormwater infrastructure is the norm in Houston and in all of our projects, and not the sort of exception. And then finally, I'll just end with did you have a question?
I was just going to ask a quick question on those incentives for the green infrastructure. What about for the city itself? Because I think that's where, when it comes to a lot of our infrastructure projects, it's actually the cities and the municipalities that are the ones doing them. And so I'm curious if you were able to start within, or if you started with incentivizing development to kind of start incorporating those projects.
Sure. So there have been a few projects in Houston that have been done both by one of our TERS. I would explain that, but it would take a while. And also, affiliated city organizations and some other folks. We are currently incorporating some green stormwater infrastructure projects into our apologies for the acronym in advance, but CDBG MIT applications, and trying to integrate them in terms of we have not publicly announced, but just got a grant to do a green stormwater infrastructure project with some partners. And so we're looking for opportunities within the city to accelerate, but also it was identified that there's such an opportunity. We need everybody to really play a role. And so these incentives will also help encourage others to move this forward, as well as steps that we're taking internally.
So when it comes to retrofits of, sidewalks and roads and things like that, did you guys sort of jump on the forefront of trying to implement some things, or have you really just created, leverage programs that private development can really take advantage of this quickly?
This set of incentives was for private development. I would say that there are some barriers that were identified to large scale green infrastructure work, particularly in the city side. And that really includes training and having the right set of folks to do the work in terms of planning for green infrastructure and executing it. And so we're working on that. Those are some of the actions that I didn't highlight. There are like hundreds of things in this plan, so it's hard to tick. But then also the importance of getting people trained on maintenance, because there are some barriers to maintaining green stormwater infrastructure. It's a little different than, mowing a lawn. And so making sure that there is that whole ecosystem that supports these changes as they move forward. So various partners internally and externally are all accelerating sort of that whole infrastructure that needs to be there in order to improve our capacity related to these projects.
Sure, that's great. Yeah, I think we all share in some of these some of the challenges to sort of massive implementation. So I was just curious if you guys had come up with something along those lines, but I think it makes sense, to work the kinks out and make sure that you have those barriers overcome. And so, thank you.
There has also been an opportunity around Harvey recovery, so that the recovery funds are paying for the infrastructure. But we are working with partners to look at what we would call amenities packages beyond the basic infrastructure that the federal funds will pay for. And so how can we work with other partners to do additional greening, do trails, do all of those amenities that you can stack on top of, in order to, again, I'm going to say it, like, solve for more than one thing.
Yeah. Thank you.
So finally, just wanted to really quickly acknowledge that the strategy and all of this work, Living with Water, came out in January. The strategy came out in February. COVID hit in March. We launched the Mayor's Health Equity Response Task Force, which I co-lead, in April. We launched a COVID-19 addendum to the resilience strategy in May. And that addendum was really about, we'd spent this, year to 18 months working on a comprehensive framework for resilience. And then COVID hit, and we hadn't identified COVID specifically, but we had created this framework. And so the addendum that we put together was really looking at all 62 actions of the strategy and identifying where the things that we were focused on as priorities before COVID really intersected with our challenges during COVID, both recovery response, adaptation, institutionalization. And we came up with and we missed one, and I'm still annoyed about it, but we came up with 2/3 of the things that we'd identified also played a role in the way that we looked at our response or recovery from COVID. And so there were a lot of opportunities to think about food access was one that we'd identified before COVID, and it's accelerated during COVID. And there were some opportunities related to community gardens and all of these uses of land and how we incorporate that with flood mitigation. So we released that and have been working both on implementing all of the actions in the resilience strategy as well as our COVID response and recovery ever since.
Well, that timeline sounded especially daunting. So I feel like I have to say I'm so sorry that you launched all these, which are really, really incredible and comprehensive and well prepared, strategies and documents before COVID hit. But it sounds like you've been able to make use of those things still, and of course they're still very much in play and very much important. And so you're well underway there. I did want to ask, specific to the Resilient Houston strategy, I know that you guys were simultaneously working on, and I'm not going to say the name of the project correct, but sort of a climate change strategy at the same time. Can you talk about the how that worked being discussed at the same time, and were people sort of very much like, but these should be connected, or how did it work to have two different conversations which were very much related at the same time with, I'm guessing, similar stakeholders and participants that are very passionate about both topics, climate change and resiliency?
Yes. So when I arrived in Houston, there was already a climate action plan process going on. And our Chief Sustainability Officer, Lara Cottingham, and I became fast friends. She was one of the few people I knew in Houston before I arrived. And so, the way that we've sort of divided and conquered here is that the resilience strategy focuses mostly on climate adaptation, and the climate action plan, which is incorporated it in Resilient Houston as a specific action. It was released in April on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. So add that to the timeline that I previously shared.
Yeah, this is a lot of good stuff has come out in the last few months. So good work on that.
Over the last few years. And that's just a testament to Mayor Turner and everything that he stands for. He was one of the founding members of Climate Mayors, and is now serving as the chair of the board of directors for the new Resilient Cities Network. That's a private 501c3 that's co-led by cities from the sort of historical project of the Rockefeller Foundation for the 100 Resilient Cities program. So thanks to him, we have this opportunity to do all of this work. And we spent that year or less than a year of planning, really looking at climate mitigation, climate adaptation, how they intersect, how they need to be worked on at the same time. And the climate action plan really focuses on greenhouse gas reduction and mitigation and carbon capture, and that portfolio area related to our buildings, related to our materials management and our waste. related to our building optimization and our transportation. And we focused on a ton more beyond that. And so you'll notice similar graphics. You'll notice that they were designed to look like they fit together because that was all intentional. We met regularly to make sure there was alignment. And then a lot of the targets that we created for the strategy, the ones that applied to the climate action plan, were incorporated in the climate action plan. And so we're implementing it all together as one really super large portfolio.
Well, it is a big portfolio, but all really important work. And so I'm glad that you guys, it does seem like you've really tried to check all the boxes of the really important conversations that need to be had, to sort of move on that trajectory, right, of being prepared for the next storm, and be right. It's way bigger than that. I keep using that terminology because that's what I say all the time, but you guys are way beyond that. So thank you for that.
I'll quickly add, the other way that we really linked the climate action plan with the resilience strategy is by working together to do a climate impact assessment that we released in September. And so we had Catherine Hayhoe, who is an amazing climate scientist, work with us to identify 25 indicators related to heat, drought, and precipitation. And we did projections to 2050 and 2100, and with a low scenario and a higher scenario for emissions. And so you can see Houston's going to get hotter, and I have survived 2 Houston summers now, and that's going to be a challenge. But Houston's going to get even hotter if we don't reduce emissions. And so that report showed how the mitigation and adaptation work has to be done together. It has to be done both, at the same time, and we have to all work together.
I think one of the things that I've seen come out of Houston, that I want to have you be able to speak to, is that it seems like although you're working really well on this high level, you also are very much in the neighborhoods. And one of the things that I saw with that sort of analysis of 1 year later after Harvey was that you had this strategy for, and I do believe it was something like the 22 neighborhoods that were identified. And again, I don't know if it was the neighborhoods or the watersheds, but that you had a project identified for each of those neighborhoods that was either developed or assessed based on having these community conversations, so that the community was very much involved in coming up with what they felt like would be the good response for them in this sort of resiliency strategy. And so I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about how you guys have engaged in the community, and then also how you've come up with some of these solutions so that everyone feels like they're getting a little bit of a piece of the pie, I guess, in resiliency. Because when you have big cities like ours, it is really hard to make everyone feel like they're a part of it, and that they're not just on the outskirts and maybe only, big money's only going downtown or something like that.
So some of that work, I think, was likely done by Harris County, great partners of ours, and the Harris County Flood Control District. And, Houston is really blessed by so many folks who are working on these challenges that we have. And everyone is doing their very, very best to be aligned and coordinated and connected. Most of the community neighborhood scale work that we've been doing related to the resilience strategy beyond the living with water work has really been the opportunity to integrate with the complete communities programs, and look at how those are plans developed by the neighbors in those communities. But we've gone through a process of assessing, it's not yet released, but how those actions that the communities have identified relate directly to the actions that we identified as priorities in the resilience strategy. And so really being able to tie the neighborhood priorities to the larger priority in terms of projects. We're just starting implementation of the larger resilience strategy, but we're looking at how to integrate using recovery funds to do some additional planning efforts. And we have a few RFPs that are out. We have a few more that we're working on. And we really looked at different neighborhoods that have had repetitive flooding, that are sort of characterized as some level of socially vulnerable, and how we can make sure that resources can get to as many communities as possible. We've set these goals of doing 50 neighborhood plans as an opportunity to really make sure that more communities are getting to participate in that scale of dialogue and conversation. And there are a number of other, there's just another one that's top of mind, this 50/50s Park Partners program that the mayor launched last year with a number of partners, looking at 50 of our neighborhood parks and how to improve them with different amenities. And part of that process was looking at both condition and sort of equity characteristics to make sure that many of our neighborhoods will receive benefits through that program as well.
You guys have a lot going on, but it also sounds like you have a lot of departments kind of working together in a cohesive and coordinated way to sort of execute this, because my question was going to be, how big is your department? But I think what maybe would help in that is, so how big is your department? But then how is it that you're able to work together with either other agencies and departments? And of course, different states have different departments, so it doesn't need to be specific, but maybe just the way that you guys are connected, and the maybe agreements that you might have with each other for getting things done. But more specifically, also in working with the community, how do you sort of, the job of a chief resiliency officer definitely is to bring people together, for common shared goals. So how do you see that yourself? How do you get it done? And then who helps you to get it done?
Sure. So technically, if you were to look at an org chart, I would be an office of one. However, I work very closely with so many partners within the mayor's office, the Complete Communities team, the recovery team, within our departments, including the sustainability team. And then part of the launch of the strategy was also an executive order that was launched as well. And that executive order directs our departments and our divisions to implement the strategy and to do a whole host of other things. But the one thing in that list that I love to highlight is having department resilience officers. And so these aren't new positions, they're existing executive or senior management level folks in every single one of our departments. Public Works has 3 who I convene regularly, who are my go-to folks, who are really helping shepherd the implementation of the strategy. And through that network, we're able to really look cross-departmentally at how, we just at our last meeting had this conversation about sort of the health benefits of tree planting and the water benefits of tree planting and the recreation and parks benefits of tree planting, and how can each of those departments really continue to work together and build upon existing efforts, but accelerate them through this resilience lens. So a lot of how I'm just a matchmaker. Sort of what are the challenges and what are the opportunities to solve them, and who needs to be at the table, and always trying to invite more people to the table than we originally think of, because it needs to be a bigger table, bigger tent in order to solve these challenges. And then we work with so many external partners from the city, so it's really a lot of the work is organizing within the city. A lot of the work is really taking advantage of strong partnerships with the private sector, with nonprofits, with academia, with pretty much anyone who's interested in anything that has to do with a very large scope of work in this plan, and working with them to get stuff done. And so it's really a great position to have. I am fortunate enough to be the only one in the world who's had this position twice. So
well, congrats to you. For those of us on the presentation today, as you know, the city of Jacksonville has proposed its first chief resiliency officer. There is legislation currently filed from City Council member Matt Carlucci that would create a department for the chief resiliency officer within the city. And so that's big news. And I believe it's anticipated that there's funding for the CRO and also a staff person in that department as well. So this is really exciting. And as Jacksonville embarks on this, and of course the city of Orlando has been leading on it, and is a city that we can look to as well to see how vast and how evolved some of these programs are. It's really great to have some leaders that we can look to try and gain some advice and see where to go next. I want to, Carolyn, you had asked a few questions in the chat, and if you're willing to unmute yourself, I'd love if you could ask Marissa them yourself, just because I think you can give a little bit of background on it, and that would be great.
Yeah, one really quick thing about all the resilience work happening in Florida, I'll just say that one of the benefits that we have in Texas is that there are 3 very awesome chief resilience officers in El Paso and Dallas and Houston. And so the idea of coordinating is something that we all do pretty often, and looking at how to take the work that we're doing in our cities and really expand it to beyond. And so it's a real great opportunity for Florida. All of the great work that's going on throughout the state, I definitely follow all the time.
Well, thank you for that. Carolyn, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Antman I'm with the Duval Audubon Society. I'm the conservation director.
Great, nice to meet
you. So we are really concerned about becoming resilient, and it sounds like it took a year and a half or more just in the planning process. What kind of timeline are you looking at in terms of the implementation? And will implementation involve the creation of a lot of new jobs?
Sure. So I will say those are great questions. From the time I hit the ground and drove 3.5 days on the 10 freeway to the time that we released the strategy was less than a year. And it took, I'm going to get this wrong, but it took more than 2.5 years to do the work in Los Angeles. So I'm really thrilled with how we were able to work with partners to accelerate the planning process in Houston. But you're right, it takes a minute, but we were looking at implementation the whole time. And so we were able to, and that's true in LA too. We were implementing things as we were doing the plan. We weren't waiting to do the plan to start implementation. You can't wait. There's so much urgency with the work. By starting implementation where you can, doing pilots, looking at opportunities to advance stuff, you actually make a better plan. In terms of jobs, and then there was another part of your question I'm gonna forget. That's the whole point. Is really looking at the economy and jobs as another real large resilience challenge. Looking at part of the projections in Houston is that we're going to have 1 million more people within the city in the next few decades. And so how can we plan for 1 million more folks? How can we build up and not out? And how can we make sure that our economy is robust and supports our resilience goals, our climate action plan goals? Energy transition is a huge part of this conversation, and that's really a jobs conversation as much as it is a climate conversation in Houston.
Thank you.
Did I miss a part though? I feel like I did.
Well, I was just thinking, how long
Oh,
do
implementation.
you feel that implementation will last?
That was it. So
Forever.
we've structured each of the targets and each of the actions around certain timeframes. And so some were within a year. COVID might mess with a little bit of that, but my goal is to have everything moving forward by February. And so at this point, 2/3 of the actions I know are moving forward. Some of the actions I don't necessarily know they're moving forward, but they could be, and that's something I need to work out in the next few months. But really trying to get everything started before February. And then some of the targets and actions are 5 years, some are 10, some are longer, but a majority of the actions are within 5 to 10 years, and just a few are long-term. And I think, you know, this is about a longer vision, but really what can we get started now? And hopefully it will be a sort of living document, but we can build upon it.
Do we have any other questions from those that are on the chat today? If so, you're welcome to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask Marissa while we have her on the line. Well, Marissa, I'll wait a minute and see if anyone else unmutes themselves, and they're welcome to chat with you. But I just wanted to highlight a few of the things you said and make sure that our viewers know that I'm going to link to all these, which now it's so many links, but I'm just super impressed. So not only do we have the Resilient Houston strategy, which is that, you know, very, I think, comprehensive, great. Yes, beautifully done. I love the font choices. And also I love the symbols, the icons inside. It's just a very user-friendly, you know, great document for.
I do have to plug that our designer is named Colleen Corcoran, and she designed both the LA strategy and the Houston strategy.
So she's for sale for Jacksonville, for us to call and say, hey, you can keep those same icons for different things and come on in and just develop something that looks that good for us.
I mean, I have never worked with somebody who read my mind as well as she did. She just made all of the sort of policy wonk stuff come to life. So I'm grateful for being able to work with her twice.
Well, and maybe I'll link to her name too if you want to send it to me in this follow-up. But so I want to link to the Resilient Houston strategy document, but also the climate change action plan that you guys were working on simultaneously, which I know is an action out of the Resilient Houston strategy. If you want the climate impact assessment, I don't know if that is as handy of a document, but it does sound like that was sort of foundational to being able to create the climate change action plan. I definitely want to link to the Living with Waters document, because that sounds like it contains a lot of, you know, here at St. John's Riverkeeper, what we would like to see come out of some of these resiliency plans, which is, you know, trying to really harness and appreciate and capture water in smart ways and give water the space that it needs to go, which I know you mentioned. How do we give water the space it needs to go and live with water, you know, as opposed to being adversely impacted by these large precipitation events. And then last, the Green Infrastructure Incentives Program. You know, we've talked a lot about ways that we can incentivize more green infrastructure. And we've got, you know, 13 counties in the St. John's River watershed that front the St. John's River watershed. All of them, you know, we would benefit from implementing more of these incentives. And I can speak to, you know, in Jacksonville specifically, we've talked a lot about just because they're, you know, really reviewing their own internal planning policy documents on some of these resiliency strategies. And so how can they incentivize some more of this? And I think that learning from what Houston has already produced is probably going to be a great foot in the door for that. And then anything you have on the Complete Communities programs, it sounds like just such an incredible way to, you know, launch some of these conversations to make sure that the needs of the communities that are being impacted by whether it's storms or shocks or impacts, that we're, you know, being responsive to them and involving them in the development of some of the solutions. I love that Houston was able to do that, and I'd love to see some a little bit more about what you guys have done so that we can make sure that we can learn from that kind of approach.
Yeah, that sounds great.
That's a lot. If there's anything else that I missed, then let me know. But all of it, we on our website, stjohnsriverkeeper.org. We're going to have the recording from today, as well as a link to all these documents from the discussion, and anything else, Marissa, that you want to send me, I'll link to. And I want to thank everyone for tuning in, and I want to thank everyone on the Facebook Live. Feel free to check out the website to find some of these things. And with that, Marissa, if you have any final thoughts, I just want to thank you so much for giving of your time today and sharing your expertise in this, and really appreciate the work that Houston's doing right now.
Thank you, and I'm just so excited to see what more y'all do. It's all about not reinventing and taking what we've done in Houston and making it even better.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Any other questions, feel free to contact me after this, and everyone have an excellent rest of your evening. Bye.